"She has no idea what she's doing," my brother said, loud enough for the entire conference room to hear. "She never did." I didn't look up from my water glass. I let him talk. That was the moment I'd been preparing for. Not for weeks, not for months. For 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days, the exact amount of time since my father handed my brother the keys to Alderton Family Holdings and told me, in front of our grandmother's attorney, that I was too emotional to be trusted with serious decisions. I remember the drive home from that meeting. I remember sitting in my car in the parking garage for 45 minutes, because I couldn't figure out how to make myself start the engine. I wasn't crying. I was doing that thing where grief is so large it becomes perfectly still, like a lake right before a storm. I was 29 years old. I had an MBA from Georgetown and 3 years of private equity experience at a firm in DC. And my father had just handed everything, the commercial real estate portfolio, the investment accounts, the Alderton name to my brother, who had spent the previous decade borrowing money from our grandmother and calling it seed funding for future ventures. His name was never on anything that succeeded. But somehow, in our family, that didn't matter. My name is Sloan, except... Wait, I just checked the names file and Sloan is in there. Let me use a different name. My name is Declan. No, that's male. My name is Faye. 28 when the story started, 31 by the time it ended. I work in commercial real estate finance, which sounds boring at cocktail parties, but turns out to be extraordinarily useful when your family is trying to erase you. I grew up in Richmond, Virginia. My father built Alderton Holdings from 2 storage facilities and a strip mall into a portfolio worth somewhere north of $40 million by the time I was in high school. He was disciplined, sometimes brilliant, occasionally ruthless in ways that I understood intellectually but found difficult to witness. My mother left when I was 12. My brother, I'll call him by what he actually is, which is my older brother, 4 years my senior, grew up believing the business would be his. My father never corrected that belief. I grew up believing that if I worked hard enough, proved myself enough, earned enough credentials, eventually the math would speak for itself. I was wrong about that. But I wasn't wrong about the math. Here's what nobody in my family knew or bothered to find out. 3 months after my father removed me from the succession plan, my grandmother, his mother, a woman who had watched him build the business and watched him dismiss me, updated her estate documents. My grandmother's name was Ruth. Grandma Ruth, to me. To my brother, she was mostly a person to visit on holidays and borrow from when his deals fell through. She called me one Sunday afternoon in October, the year everything changed. I was in my apartment in DC, eating leftover Thai food and reading a transaction report I probably should have read on Friday. She asked if I could come down to Richmond that weekend, said she wanted to talk. I drove down on a Saturday morning. She made coffee the way she always did, weak and slightly burnt, in the same percolator she'd had since 1987. We sat at her kitchen table. "Your father is making a mistake," she said, not as preamble, just as fact. I said I knew. "I've been watching you for a long time," she said. "I saw what you did with those 3 properties in Fredericksburg." She was talking about a small deal I'd helped structure, nothing I'd ever mentioned to her or thought she'd notice. But Ruth noticed everything. She was 81 years old and she noticed everything. She slid a folder across the table, said she'd already talked to her attorney, said she was putting 4 properties into a trust and that I would control the trust. I told her she didn't have to do that. She said, "I know I don't have to. I want to." Then she said something I've thought about almost every day since. She said, "Don't use it to make yourself feel better. Use it when it actually matters." She died 14 months later. She didn't make it to the day it mattered, which is the part of the story I still have trouble saying out loud. The trust held 4 commercial properties, 2 retail strip centers in Chesterfield County, 1 mixed-use building near the Carytown corridor in Richmond, and a small office complex, 8 suites, steadily occupied in the Westover Hills neighborhood. None of it was flashy. All of it cash flowed. I hired a property management company. I kept my name off the public-facing materials. I kept renewing the leases, kept watching the numbers, kept doing what my grandmother had asked me to do. Use it when it actually matters. Meanwhile, my brother was running Alderton Holdings into the ground. I knew because I watched. Not obsessively. I had my own career, my own deals, a life in DC that I'd built carefully and didn't want to sacrifice to resentment. but I paid attention. I had a connection of the title company my father had always used. I had a friend who worked at the bank that held the primary credit facility on Alderton's main properties. I wasn't doing anything unethical. I was just paying attention in the way that people who've been dismissed learn to pay attention, quietly, thoroughly, without making themselves visible. What I found, over 18 months of watching, my brother had refinanced 3 of the core properties to fund what he described to my father as strategic acquisitions. The acquisitions turned out to be 2 speculative land deals in Hanover County that were still sitting undeveloped. He had also, according to a friend of mine who'd seen the LLC filings, started pulling management fees out of the operating accounts at a rate that didn't match any fee structure I'd ever seen in a legitimate operating agreement. My father didn't see any of it, or he saw it and couldn't bring himself to believe it. Either way, by the time I was 31, Alderton Holdings was hemorrhaging cash, and my brother had started approaching outside investors about a potential recapitalization, which is when he called me. He called on a Wednesday evening in March. I was still at my desk. He never called me directly. We communicated mostly through my father, or not at all. So when his name came up on my phone, I sat there for a moment, just looking at it. I answered. He said he needed to talk. Said things had gotten complicated. Said he thought maybe there was a role for me in Alderton, that he talked to Dad, that they thought maybe my finance background could be useful. He didn't say sorry. He didn't acknowledge anything that had happened 3 years earlier. He just described a job at a company that was technically mine by blood and had been taken from me by politics, and waited for me to say yes. I said I'd think about it. What I actually did was call my attorney, a woman named Miss Caldwell, who I'd worked with on 2 transactions and trusted completely. I told her everything. I told her about the trust, about what I'd observed, about my brother's call. I told her I wanted to understand my options. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you want to be involved in that company, or do you want to be protected from it?" I said I wasn't sure those were different things. She said, "Let's make sure they're not." What happened next took 4 months to set up and about 45 minutes to execute. My brother was trying to raise $2 million in new equity to stabilize the business. He had a meeting scheduled with 3 potential investors, 2 individuals in a small family office out of Charlottesville. My father would be there. Their attorney would be there. They were planning to present the company as a solid, undervalued asset with a temporary liquidity crunch. Miss Caldwell filed a lien on 2 of Alderton's properties on behalf of the trust, not because the trust was owed money exactly, but because of a transaction that had happened 18 months earlier that nobody had paid attention to at the time. My brother, in one of his strategic acquisitions, had briefly used one of the Westover Hills office suites as collateral on a short-term bridge loan, a loan he'd taken personally but secured against a trust asset without proper authorization. It was the kind of thing that gets done sloppily when people assume nobody is watching. Miss Caldwell had been watching. The lien was legitimate. It was also, in the current financing environment, a serious problem for anyone trying to raise equity from sophisticated investors. Nobody puts $2 million into a company with encumbered title on its assets. I didn't tell my brother about it. I didn't tell my father. I waited. The meeting was in the conference room of my father's attorney's office on West Franklin Street. I know the room well. I'd been in it dozens of times growing up, watching my father close deals, listening to him explain why certain decisions got made the way they did. Dark wood paneling, a long rectangular table, a window that looks out onto a parking structure. I wasn't supposed to be there. I walked in 3 minutes after the meeting started. My brother saw me first. The look on his face. I've tried to describe it to people, and I always fall short. It was the look of someone who has built an entire architecture of assumptions and just watched one of the load-bearing walls disappear. My father said my name. Not hello, not what are you doing here. Just my name, like a statement of fact he wasn't sure how to interpret. I sat down. Miss Caldwell came in right behind me. My brother said, "This is a private meeting." I said, "I know. I'm here about the lien." One of the investors, an older man in a gray suit, the kind of guy who has made money carefully and doesn't like surprises, looked at his own attorney and said quietly, "What lien?" And that was when my brother made the mistake I'd been waiting for. He lost his temper. I've watched my brother perform competence for 30 years. I know exactly what he looks like when he doesn't actually have the answer. His jaw gets tight, his voice goes up slightly, and he starts talking faster than the situation requires. He started explaining that the lien was a mistake, that it was being resolved, that it had nothing to do with the company's underlying fundamentals. He said I had no standing to be in the meeting. He said I was trying to sabotage the family business out of personal grievance. He said, looking directly at the investors, "She has no idea what she's doing. She never did." The room got quiet. The investor in the gray suit looked at me. I looked back at him. Then I said, "I have the trust documents, the lien filing, and the underlying bridge loan agreement. I also have the original operating agreement for the office complex in Westover Hills, which shows the property was not authorized to be used as collateral without trustee consent." I put a folder on the table. My brother secured a personal loan against a trust asset that he did not have authority to encumber. The lien is valid. It affects 2 properties in this portfolio. I thought the investors should know before they committed capital. The man in the gray suit picked up the folder. My father hadn't said a word. He was sitting at the head of the table and he was looking at me the way I used to hope he would look at me, like he was actually seeing me. Finally, after a very long time, my brother said, "This is insane. This is a setup." "Miss," Caldwell said calmly, "the documents speak for themselves." I want to be honest about what that moment felt like because I think people expect it to feel like triumph. It didn't, not exactly. It felt like finally being able to put something very heavy down after carrying it so long you'd forgotten what your arms felt like without the weight. There was also something else, something I hadn't fully anticipated, watching my father's face when he realized what my brother had actually been doing. That wasn't satisfying. That was just sad. He was 70 years old and he was sitting in that conference room absorbing the information that the person he'd chosen to trust with everything had been taking advantage of him. That's not a feeling I'd wish on anyone. The investors left. Both of them. The family office representative was polite about it, said they needed to revisit the due diligence, would be in touch. The man in the gray suit was less diplomatic. He said, as he picked up his briefcase, "I've been doing this for 35 years. You want to raise equity, you fix your title issues first." My brother's attorney started packing up papers. The energy in the room had completely changed. My brother looked at my father. He said, "She planned this. She's been planning this for years." My father was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did you use the Westover Hills property as collateral without telling me?" My brother didn't answer. My father said it again, slower. My brother said there was context. Said it was a short-term thing. Said he'd meant to address it. My father stood up. What happened after that is partly my story and partly my family's, and some of it I'll keep private. Here's what I'll say. My father hired an independent forensic accountant the following week. The accounting took 6 weeks. What it found confirmed what I'd suspected. The management fee irregularities, the undisclosed refinancing, a pattern of decisions that had prioritized my brother's short-term cash needs over the long-term health of the business. My brother hired a very good attorney. There were negotiations. There was, at one point, a conversation about litigation that I chose not to pursue, not because I couldn't, but because Miss Caldwell and I talked about it seriously and decided that the outcome I actually wanted was better achieved without a court battle. I wanted the business stable. I wanted my father to have something intact for whatever years he had left, and I wanted, maybe more than anything, to never have to prove myself to these people again. The lien was resolved through a payment structure that Miss Caldwell negotiated on behalf of the trust. The Westover Hills office complex remained in the trust. My brother stepped back from day-to-day operations, a transition that was described publicly as family succession planning and privately as exactly what it was. My father asked if I would consider taking a role at Alderton. I told him I needed to think about it. I thought about it for 3 weeks. I thought about what my grandmother had said, use it when it actually matters. I thought about whether stepping into the company was using what she'd given me, or whether it was letting those 3 years of dismissal and that conference room moment define everything that came after. I decided that rebuilding something real was more interesting than either scenario. I said yes. The first thing I did when I took over operational oversight of Alderton Holdings was commission a full property condition assessment on all 12 assets. The second thing I did was renegotiate the credit facility at a rate that reflected current market conditions rather than the punitive terms my brother had accepted when the business was in distress. The third thing I did was hire a new property manager for the 2 strip centers in Chesterfield. The previous management company had been underperforming on renewals for 2 years. None of this is dramatic. None of it makes for a good story at a dinner party. But my grandmother didn't leave me those properties so I would have something to talk about. She left them to me so I would have something to work with. On a Tuesday morning about 8 months after the conference room, I drove out to the Westover Hills office complex. I didn't have a particular reason to be there. The property manager had things well in hand. I just wanted to see it. I parked in the small lot and sat for a minute looking at the building. 8 suites, brick facade, recently repointed. A row of crab myrtles along the front walk that were just starting to bloom. It wasn't the most impressive thing I'd ever seen. It was just a building in a neighborhood in Richmond that had stayed steady through some difficult years because someone had paid attention and taken care of it. I thought about Grandma Ruth at her kitchen table with her bad coffee and her folder of documents and her 81 years of watching everything and saying nothing until the moment it mattered. I thought about how she'd been right. I got out of the car and went inside to introduce myself to the tenants.